All right, so to recap very quickly, some of the big ideas that have been shared in this chapter. Idea number one is that the word for mitzvah, which is usually translated as good deed, does not mean good deed. Rather, it means connection or partnership. And that's because when we do a mitzvah, we're connecting with the divine and we're elevating this world, this material world, into the spiritual realms. So that's really the maybe dominant idea of this chapter. Then we went to speak about different types of mitzvot. We're still under the category of the different types of mitzvot here. We spoke about the mitzvahs of Shabbat and holidays, which are not just, again, good deeds or good days or holidays, as we would call them, but they are days of meeting. That's why holidays in Hebrew is Mo'adim. Mo'adim means meeting. That's because during those holidays and on Shabbat, we are there to meet God without and within, to meet our deepest self, which is a part of God, which is God himself. So that's another way to prove that mitzvot is not just a good deed, but a connection. It's a meeting with God. And we even have days in the Jewish calendar that are dedicated to these meetings. Last mitzvah we spoke about, which was last class, spoke about the mitzvah of Kashrut, of keeping kosher. And the main idea that really is the root of this mitzvah is that we keep kosher, not just to watch what we eat, or not just because what we eat, what we eat, and kosher animals are non-predators, so we don't want to inherit characteristics of predators. But the deepest reason of why we keep kosher is so that our body itself, that which consumes the food, can also be connected with God. So in a way, it is transforming. These laws of Kashrut are there to transform our materialistic beings into spiritual ones, at least the body itself. So that was really, I think, the biggest idea regarding these laws of Kashrut. Let's continue here at the bottom of page 122. Does anyone want to read? Altogether, the mixing of two different orders. That's where we're up to, right, Gila?
Yeah, yes, Rabbi.
Okay.
I wonder, Rabbi,
yes,
I wonder if it would be possible just to share very, very quickly why we read out loud and why it's important to consider reading out loud. If you remember the original concept, that was that originally Rabbi Steinsaltz had an idea, and the idea was to write a book. And the book was the 13 Petalled Rose, and it was about a certain topic, and it was about taking the material into the spiritual.
Right.
And so when Rabbi Steinsaltz Zichrono Livracha was ill, we thought together, why don't we speak the words that he can no longer speak because his speech was impaired? And then ultimately, after he passed away, we continued reading out loud. And I think the ultimate transformative process is to take the words that are written in a book and to read them out loud and to take them more into the spiritual domain. And that's why we read out loud. So I hope that it gives more meaning in that, and that people will feel that it's important to participate in this. We would call it perhaps a mitzvah or something very deeply connected to Rabbi Steinsaltz.
Right. Very well said. I think I mentioned this in the past, but in the same context, Rabbi Steinsaltz would tell the story of how when he was just 20 or 21 years old, he would give a class to some of the most prominent dignitaries of the state of Israel, including the president of the state of Israel, for example. And he would very often share that he would feel intimidated. After all, these people were not just wiser than him, but they were much older than him. And then he reached the conclusion that all these people came not to listen to him, Rabbi Steinsaltz, but to listen to the voice of the Torah, which was being channeled through him. The voice of the Torah is about 3,300 years old. So he himself was 3,321 years old. And the others were maybe 60 or 7 years old. So he looked at himself really as the oldest man in the room, even though he was only 20 years old. Because if you add to that the age of the Torah, which is why they came, then of course he was the oldest. So he was just being the channel. And I think that when we read the words of Rabbi Steinsaltz, we too are becoming the channel to his words. We're not reading our own words. Whoever is reading, by the way, should see themselves as the mouthpiece of Rabbi Steinsaltz. That's all. Okay, so bottom of page 122, all together. Anyone? Oh, maybe it's intimidating people now that we said that.
Now
Oh,
that we-
Linda, please, go for it.
Who do we have? Do we have someone?
Yeah, Linda. Linda, go for it. Please read.
Linda.
Okay.
Please.
Of
Thank
course. And Gila, that was beautiful. I really appreciated your saying that. So yes, of course I would volunteer. So thank you so very much. That was beautiful.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Altogether, the mixing of two different orders of things is a general prohibition in the halakha, even beyond the dietary laws of Kashrut. To be sure, not in every realm of existence do we know the frontiers of distinction between one order and another, but the Torah has specified a number of them for the sake of maintaining a degree of purity. The basic principle is, of course, not purity for its own sake, but the need to bring all things in the world to the state of tikkun, or perfection, to raise them up by correcting, remedying, and setting them right, to recreate a thing by stripping it to its essential, to redeem it by allowing it to be its utmost. So that the act of eating something should not be a destruction and a ravaging, but a tikkun, or consecration of the food. And the eating of impure food or improperly mixed food depresses and causes a person to descend or diminish in terms of level of being.
Right. So the act of eating itself could be an act that is essentially divine, if we can transform the experience into a divine experience. Unfortunately, very often, the act of eating overwhelms us or even overcomes us, that it is the food that it's in control. And therefore, it's matter over spirit instead of spirit over matter. I recall how the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Schneesen of blessed memory, would be very careful. He would barely eat, by the way. There's a great story that someone just shared with me this past Shabbat, of how this man heard that there's free food in Crown Heights, where the Lubavitcher Rebbe lived, and particularly in the Rebbe's home. So he came all the way from a different neighborhood to get free food. And he walked into the Rebbe's home, and his wife went to the door and she welcomes him. He says to her, I heard that there's free food. Can I have lunch? Now, she wasn't going to say no. So she says to him, yes, of course, welcome. And he sits down to eat, but he says, well, no, I also heard that the Rebbe joins us for lunch. I'm not going to eat if the Rebbe's not here. So she said to him, fine. I'm going to call the Rebbe for you. She tells the Rebbe exactly what the situation is. The Rebbe has pity on another Jew. He says, fine, okay. And he sits down to eat lunch with this guy. That's the definition of chutzpah almost. Anyway, when this man leaves, the Rebbe's wife, ran after him and said to this man, I want to thank you because the Rebbe hasn't eaten in 3 days. Thanks to you, he finally ate. But the Rebbe barely ate. But my point is, when he would eat, and sometimes he would also eat in public, he was very careful about a very specific detail that many of us are not even aware of. I wasn't aware of it until I heard the story about the Rebbe. But I think it's a very important one, and even a defining one. And that is that when the Rebbe ate, he never lowered his face to the food, as some of us may do when we eat. Rather, he brought the food up to him. Why? To show that he was in control of the food. The food is not going to tell him to lower his head. He's going to bring the food up to him. He's not going to lower himself down to the level of the food. Now, it's a little detail that's very often ignored or overlooked, but it's a detail, I think, that epitomizes exactly what we just said. And that is that the act of eating has the potential of being a divine act. If we are the ones in control, and if we are the ones elevating the food to our spiritual level. If it's the opposite, then it's matter over spirit. Then it's the food that is in control. And then we've missed the opportunity of transforming some of a part of God's materialistic world into a spiritual experience, into a spiritual entity. That's really what it's about. And by the way, he speaks of the word tikkun here, which is an interesting word. Maybe it's a word that's used so loosely these days. Everyone speaks of tikkun olam, without really knowing what it means. And they usually think that it means one thing while it means really something else. What is tikkun? Tikkun in Hebrew means to fix. That's what it means, letaken. And it comes from the expression in the prayer itself, the final prayer of the morning, of the afternoon, and of the evening, there is the prayer of Valeno. We sing here at CBT, Aleinu l'shabeach lado, Nakol. It's a prayer that unfortunately doesn't get much attention because by then everyone wants to go home, everyone wants to go and eat by the Kiddush. Everyone says, great, the davening is finished. I can start taking, making my steps outside of the sanctuary. And it's one of the most beautiful prayers. In fact, Kabbalists teach that this prayer went to God and cried out and said, God, they don't give me enough attention because you put me at the very end of the prayer. People are hungry by then, or they're rushing to work by then, and they walk all over me. So God said to this prayer, Aleinu, don't worry. I'll make up for you. I'll make it up for you. How so? I'm going to put you in the most important prayer of the year. And indeed, during the Yom Kippur Musaf and during the Rosh Hashanah Musaf, we have the prayer of Valeno. And then we have no choice but to finally focus on it, because it's not at the middle, it's not at the end of the prayer, it's right in the middle of one of the most important prayers of the year. So that's the Aleinu prayer. But towards the end of the Aleinu prayer, you have the line of Letaken Olam B'Malchut Shaddai, which is where the word Tikkun Olam comes from, or Tikkun comes from. What does that mean? To repair the world with the kingship of God, the Malchut Shaddai. That's what it means. So Tikkun does not just mean to repairing or doing feel-good acts. What Tikkun really means is that I'm repairing with the world with the kingship of God. I'm bringing spirituality to the world. I'm fusing this world with the divine. If I haven't infused the world with the divine, if I haven't bridged heaven and earth, so to speak, I could think that I did an act of tikkun, but it's not the tikkun that the sages envision. It's not the Jewish tikkun. Maybe it's some other tikkun, but it's not the Jewish tikkun. Tikkun is particularly when I am fully cognizant of this idea that it is my responsibility to transform this material world into a heavenly one, to take the act of eating and elevating it to a spiritual realm. That's when I am tikkun. That's when I'm fixing this world, veritably. Otherwise, it's no tikkun. So it's just an important point to emphasize. But Linda, I know you had a question, please.
Well, no, I 100% appreciate it and love what you just said. But what really spoke to me was talking about recreating a thing by stripping it to its essential, to redeem it by allowing it to be its utmost. Like, to me, that was like, getting rid of everything except the true soul. And that's how you can become who you're meant to be. So like, I took that beyond food, right. and I just found it to be very profound.
Right. Very good. Very good. So I want to go and explore a Hebrew word with you. And that word is ochel, which is the word for food. It's an interesting word in Hebrew because, as you may know, many Hebrew words have many different meanings. So the word for food is ochel, which really means food. But the Kabbalists also teach that the word ochel can be divided into two words. Aleph, which is the first letter of the word ochel, and then chaf lamed, which are the other two letters of the word ochel, which spells out the word kol, right? Or chol, which means everything. Aleph, kol. That's the word food. Aleph, kol. Aleph, everything. What's Aleph? Aleph is the letter of God. Aleph has a numerical value in Hebrew of 1. And that represents the oneness of God in everything. Ochel, Kabbalistically, means not just food, but it means that God is in everything, even in the soil of earth, even in those fruits, even in those vegetables, even in those trees. God is in it. And like you were saying, Linda, our duty, therefore, in the act of eating is to reveal that Aleph, to reveal the oneness, not to let it continue to hide or to let it sink with some pleasurable act of eating, but rather to elevate it. By the way, it's not an easy act, right? To be cognizant of the fact that each time I have an apple, or each time I have my coffee, or each time I drink a good iced tea because it gets hot here in the summer, I I'm elevating the aleph that's stuck in this food. We have to be truly cognizant of it. And at the same time, we will then have to use the energy that the iced tea gave me or the coffee gave me to do good. Otherwise, I'm not elevating the aleph. But on the other hand, it's incumbent upon each and every one of us to do so. Now, maybe that's why many, like the Lubavitcher Rebbe we were saying, but many other rabbis and sages and saints would not eat too much. They would fast quite often. On Shabbat, by the way, they would eat a lot. On Shabbat, it's an easier act. To elevate food is much easier. Why? Because there is a mitzvah on Shabbat to honor the Shabbat with food. So just by the act of eating on Shabbat, I'm honoring the Shabbat. And that in of itself is a mitzvah. So the food is elevated through this mitzvah. But during the weekdays, there's no mitzvah to eat to honor the weekdays. So it's a much harder act. But on the other hand, it's a necessary one and depends on us. Animals can do that. They eat, but they can't do that. We, on the other hand, can do that. And it's really a transformative act when we actually do it. Speaking of kosher, not kosher, one of the symbols of non-kosher food is, of course, pigs. And it became like this animal that we're almost like allergic to in Judaism. And there's many parables with pigs, and pigs never stand for something good. Even though, by the way, pigs will be kosher when Mashiach comes. And that's what the Talmud says. That's why the name for pig is chazir. Chazir means to return, not just pig. Lachzor in Hebrew. Because that animal will be returned to us. We'll be able to eat it when the Mashiach will come. But what's interesting, just an interesting zoological fact about pigs, is that, did you know that pigs are the only animals that physically can't look heavenward? They can't. Their neck is built in such a way that it's impossible for them to lift their heads. You look it up, you'll see. But the deeper meaning to that is that the symbol of non-kosher, right? The symbol of what we don't identify with is that which cannot look heavenward. What does that mean? That the antidote to pigs, which should be us, is people that look heavenwards. And if we can look heavenwards, not just in our sight, but in our actions, including eating and taking this food and elevating it, as we've been speaking about, then what differentiates us and pigs? Not much. But that's really an important, maybe an important point to make. Anyhow, again, I would love for this to be much more of a dialogue than a monologue. So feel free to ask your questions and comment or disagreements or. Okay, otherwise we can continue. All right, let's continue then. Therefore, 2, eating and drinking on Shabbat. This is not touching upon the Shabbat and holidays and the act of eating then that we just spoke about. Does anyone want to read?
I'll read.
Please, go for it. Go, Joyce. Go for it.
Therefore, eating and drinking on Sabbaths and festival days becomes more than a satisfying of normal instincts. It is a mitzvah in itself, because on such holy days, the nation can better raise up and hallow the things of this world, and the feast becomes an occasion of unity with the Creator. When the temple stood, ritual sacrifice was itself an occasion for a communal meal in which man participated with a higher power in an act of communion. To this day, an ordinary table is considered to be a sort of altar at which the one who partakes of food performs an analogous act. However, incompletely elevating matter to the level of man by making it serve human purpose and drawing certain forces away from the world in the active domain of holiness. Extreme care has therefore to be exercised with respect to what is eaten, and the manner in which one eats has to be consistent with the purpose of consecration. Eating is not a casual hedonistic act. It is a ceremony.
Right. So I want to go to one of the great Jewish customs, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, and that is that there should be salt on every table. Not only should there be salt on every table, but the challah that we eat, or the bread that we eat, each time we do a motzi, not just on Shabbat, by the way, but each time we have bread during the week, we should dip that bread in the salt that is on the table. Why? Because it ought to remind us of the sacrifices in the temple. In the temple, there was salt on the altar 24/7, and sacrifices were very often dipped in that salt, or there was salt added to the sacrifices. Why was there salt to add? Why salt and why not pepper or I don't know, zatar, the famous Israeli spice? That's a different question, but I can get to it soon too. But the temple was a place in which we did just what we're speaking about: bring animals and elevate them to God. By the way, the word for sacrifice in Hebrew, another beautiful Hebrew word, is korban. Korban does not just mean sacrifice. It means to come close. It comes from the word karev. That's because every time we brought a sacrifice, we brought this world, or the animal in particular, closer to God. And we brought ourselves with the sacrifice, or through the sacrifice, closer to God. So the act of sacrificing was an act of bringing ourselves close to God. Now, when we eat, we ought to remind ourselves that it's almost like the sacrifice. And therefore, we put salt on the table. Therefore, we dip our challah in the salt, our bread into the salt, to remind ourselves that the activity that we're about to engage in is an activity that should resemble the activity of the sacrifices in the temple. And that activity was bringing you close to God. So the act of eating now too should bring you close to God. Now, that's what he's speaking about here, the altar. Now, I want to add to that and say that it's he says it's a ceremony to eat, but it's a ceremony each time we come close to God. Each time we can take this world and transform it into a divine place. Why so? Because these ceremony, and going back again to the Torah, but these ceremony, what was called a ceremony, I don't think Rabbi Steinsaltz uses this word loosely. It's a nice word. It's a poetic way of putting it, but I think there's much more to that. The ceremonies that we encounter in the Torah, all of them have a common denominator, whether it was the ceremony of the inauguration of the tabernacle, for example, or the ceremony of the entrance into the land of Israel, for example. Whatever ceremony the Torah is speaking about, the common denominator between all ceremonies is that the Shekhinah, God's presence, came down to the Jewish people. When we eat, it's a ceremonial act, because if we eat in the proper way, we're also bringing God's presence down to the food, and we're therefore elevating the food. So I don't think this word is being used loosely. I think Rabbi Steinsaltz is using this word particularly to indicate that eating has the potential to create the same type of biblical ceremonies that brought down the divine presence. That's how important the eating is. Now, maybe the story that epitomizes, to share a story, maybe it's a short story I've shared in the past, or maybe not. But to maybe make this point through the following story, it was the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, once dreamt of his neighbor in the world to come. So he said to himself, wow, this neighbor must be a special man. Let's go and visit him. And he took a few students, and he took his wagon, and he went a few villages away, and he located this man, and he realized that this man was a butcher. And so he didn't tell him the reason he was there to visit him, but he decided to observe him, to see if there was anything special that he did throughout the day. and he sees that this man is really nothing special about it. The only thing that he does all day is that he eats, and he eats, and he eats, and he eats. He eats to the point that he was very obese. So he said maybe at night when he finishes to work, that's when he leaves, and that's when he goes and helps the needy or whatever it is. So he stayed up all night, spying on this man. And again, this guy was sleeping all night. Next morning, wakes up and he continues to eat and sell meat. And he did that for 3 days. And then the Baal Shem Tov can't believe his eyes. He says, what? This man who's all about eating, he's going to be my neighbor in paradise? I have to find out. There must be something more, but I can't find anything. So in the end, he confronted him. After 3 days, he said, look, I have to ask you a question. Is there anything special about you? He said, no, nothing special about me. He says, do you do any acts, anonymous acts of kindness? No, nothing special about me. Leave me alone. He says, there must be something special about you. He says, why do you eat all the time? And the man says, oh, I eat all the time, not because I'm hungry. I eat all the time for a very specific reason. Why? He says, let me tell you the story. The man, this butcher says to the Baal Shem Tov, when I was 7 years old, Cossacks came into my little village and they started killing Jews and defiling the village altogether. And they kidnapped my father. And I couldn't stand the sight of seeing my father being kidnapped. So I followed my father with his kidnappers. And they took him into a forest. And there they tied my father to a tree. Then all of a sudden, as I was hiding behind the bushes, I see that they set the tree on fire, wanting to burn my father completely. And my father was killed, burned to death. Problem was that my father was a tiny, slim man. And when he burned to death, there was only a little fire. Right there and then, at the age of 7, I said to myself, I'm going to eat and eat and eat and become as fat as possible, so that if the Cossacks come to my village and tie me to a tree, the whole world should see that here is a Jew burning. And the Baal Shem Tov understood, you see, now I understand why you'll be my neighbor in paradise. This man's every act of eating was for the sanctification of God's name. And it's not a level we can reach maybe, or that I can reach, maybe you can. But it's certainly a level that we can aspire to. There must be a greater goal to eating than just enjoying that ice cream, than just eating. There's a much greater goal to it. And that's the tikkun olam, that's the sacrifice. This man's every bite was to create a fire. So his entire being through food turned into a walking Kiddush Hashem, a walking sanctification of God's name. So it's something that a possibility we can walk into. Anyhow. Now, by the way, I know we're speaking here, the theme is food, right? And maybe the theme is food, and Rabbi Steinsaltz emphasizes this theme so strongly because it's what we do all the time, right? Morning, afternoon, and evening. Some people have 3 meals a day, some people have 20 meals a day, but we do it all the time. So it's a prevalent act in a human life. And therefore, it's an act that we have to be cognizant of even more than other acts which are less prevalent. But this is nonetheless true for every other act. It's not just food. When we engage in sports, and we can do sports for sport's sake, or we can do sports to be healthier human beings, to be able to serve God more healthily and more powerfully. So every physical act that we engage in must have the same intention. Food is a dominant subject because it's more dominant in the human life. I don't know what the statistics are, but if a person lives, 100 years, out of those 100 years, I think we spend 20 years eating, something like that. So that's why it's so dominant here. Okay, friends, please open up questions, comments.
So
I just wanted to say, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Jordan.
Either one.
Okay, I was just going to say, it reminded me of, this when you mentioned sports, I know that in surfing, surfers are very reverent of the ocean and their connection to the ocean and God. Mm-hmm. They make a prayer ahead of time, in whatever religion they are, they make a prayer, and it's a very strong connection gratitude and connection to that it is God is in charge.
Right.
It's God's in charge.
Right.
And the waves, to connect with the waves and to be of service in connection to all of that is in the sea.
Right.
So I think it fit with what we're saying, this human connection and the reverence, and it's not just an act. It's very, very consciously connected to prayer.
Very well said. That's right. There's a Hasidic expression that if you connect it above, you can't sink below. Right? It's the snapping. Right? Have you ever done snapping in mountains? So if you connect it above, you don't sink below. And it's true for surfers and it's true for life. And food can bring us low. But if we're connected above, we can't sink below. Yeah. Yeah, Jordan, please.
So on the subject of food, you've talked about animal soul versus your divine soul. And so I guess initially I always thought that eating in general was a more animalistic activity, one in where you're just fulfilling a basic need. But I guess what you're suggesting is that it can also be feeding your divine soul by the intention that goes into it.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. It could be feeding your divine soul, and it could be geared by your divine soul. It can be feeding the divine soul if it's geared by the divine soul. So I think that, right, we have two forces in us. We've spoken about this in the context of this class too, that there's the animal soul that wants us to act animalistically, and there's the divine soul that wants us to act divinely. Now, if we eat just to eat, then we're acting like an animal. That's why animals eat. They eat just to eat because they're hungry. And that will be feeding the animal soul. But if we eat to make that activity a divine activity, a ceremony, like we said, to elevate the food and to repair God's world, tikkun olam malchut shakai, then we're feeding the divine soul. That's right.
And the rituals the prayers or the rituals that you follow or that you believe can be more empowering towards letting your divine soul lead the process, washing your hands, individual prayer over bread. What are the basic?
Absolutely. I think there's a few goals, and that's certainly one of the ways to achieve that, right? Some people say blessings over food, but it's still feeding the animal soul because it's just a box that they have to check, and then they can eat and be gluttonous. But praise nonetheless very much help in that process of elevating the food, right? There's a blessing for every type of food there is out there. There's a blessing for fruits, there's a blessing for vegetables, there's a blessing for cakes, there's blessings for liquids, like from alcohol to water. And there's a blessing, of course, for wine, agefen, there's a blessing for bread, hamotzi. And by the way, there's not just a before blessing, but there's also an after blessing to ensure that we are surrounding the food experience with divine words. Now, I've noticed that blessings not only come to elevate the food through their holy words, but I see that in my children. I see that when they have to say a blessing over a food that they want to eat, especially over the candies that they want to eat or the ice creams that they want to eat, and they have to say a blessing, they all of a sudden have to stop for a few seconds because it takes a few seconds to say the blessing. And I don't think there's anything greater in life that teaches self-control than this. If the kid has to wait 3 seconds, he's dying to jump on that ice cream, but he waits 3 seconds because he has to say a blessing. It's the greatest act of self-control that one can teach children. It's amazing. I see it all of a sudden. Now they're a little more control. It's amazing what a few seconds do, by the way, when we're in that obsessive mindset of, let me eat already. If you just pause a few seconds, you'll see that it can change the whole experience of eating. But blessings achieve that because they force you to stop. If you said, by the time you finish the blessing, a few seconds have elapsed. So that in and of itself, I think, is a great benefit of blessings. But of course, the words of the blessings should remind us that here we are with God, and God is eating with us, so to speak. We're not eating by ourselves. Are we inviting God to the table, or are we expelling him from the table? So the blessing comes to invite God. And then there's the after blessing. And after blessing, by the way, is unique to Judaism. I know Christians say blessings before they eat. Muslims say blessings before they eat. Judaism, I don't know about Buddhists, Hindus also say blessings before they eat. But I don't know if any other religion like Judaism says blessings after they eat, not just before. Why do we say blessings after we eat? Part of the reason is to say to the human being that, you know what, when you were hungry, of course you needed God. You want God to provide. That's human nature. When I'm in trouble, I turn to God. God, help me out. Now, once God helped me out, maybe I'll say, I don't need God anymore. It's like the story with this guy who was looking for a parking space in New York City, and he's going around the block for the 17th time. And then he says to God, you know what, God, if you help me find a parking space, I promise you I'll give half of my fortune to charity. All of a sudden, a parking space opens up right next to him. He says to God, you know what, forget about it. I already found the parking space. So some people say, oh, you know what, I need God when I'm looking for a parking space or when I need food. What about once you've eaten, once you found that parking space, will you still be connected to God? So the blessing after the meal ensures that you're still connected to God and you're still grateful to the source of your food, even though you're already satisfied, even though your prayers were already answered. And that's really unique because that's a higher level of connection to God. It's not a connection out of need. It's a connection out of want. And that's a
Rabbi, it's like taking a class like this, and it makes you want to take other classes and do other things.
Okay, I'm glad to hear. Thank you, Diana. Yeah.
Rabbi? Oh,
Yes.
yeah. So between the blessing or eating, and I apologize if I interrupted you or in the middle of saying another.
Yes.
Sure, no.
So between the blessing of the eating and the concluding blessings after the eating, there is the act of eating. There is the act of tasting, chewing, swallowing, digesting, that whole thing. Do we, again, we wouldn't do anything. I mean, I guess we wouldn't do much else in life, but we could focus minute by minute, second by second on the gift, on the multiple gifts of the ability to chew. Some people lose their teeth and they can't. Some people have health issues and they can't swallow. And on it goes in terms of digestion and the whole GI thing.
Right.
Is there anything Kabbalistically that exists that you might share about that whole process?
Right. So yes, there are many things I can share. I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but first of all, there is a blessing also for going to the restroom. That's the blessing of Asha Yatsar. It's one of the most beautiful blessings. You can find it in every prayer book. And I encourage you to say it after each and every time you go to the restroom. By the way, someone in our community just had a massive surgery, and he decided to take upon himself to say this blessing now because he has a renewed appreciation for the body that God gave him after the surgery. It's really a beautiful blessing, but that's for going to the restroom, and that's after the digestion system has worked its magic. But while the digestion system is working, while we're even chewing, so there are, you'll believe it or not, but the actual laws, Maimonides is the one that maybe elaborates those laws the most of how to eat. For example, you spoke about chewing. Maimonides says that one should chew his food at least 17 times before he swallows them. 17 times, imagine. You have to chew a piece of meat 17 times before you swallow it. Now, of course, he was also coming as teaching that as a doctor, so that the digestion system doesn't have to overwork itself. You've done the work by chewing on that piece of meat 17 times. Are we cognizant of that while we eat? I'm not, I can tell you that. I'll be honest, I not always. I mean, it's at the back of my mind. 17 times is a lot. So you have laws like that. How much can you eat? Maimonides is also big into that. You have to eat until you are 2/3 full. Not completely full, according to Maimonides. By the way, that's exactly what McDonald's tried to do. I remember reading an article about that. That when they first designed the McDonald's burger, they designed it so that you would be 2/3 full. And then automatically you would feel not full, so you would order a second McDonald's burger. So they will make more money because they designed the sandwich. They wouldn't make you fully full. So, but according to Maimonides, you shouldn't be full. You should be 2/3 full.